In the beginning, when the earth was young, and the heavens still sang with the voice of their Maker, God formed the world with a hand that ordered light and shadow, water and dry land, seed time and harvest. In the fullness of that forming, he set a garden eastward, and there he placed the man and the woman, and they walked with him in the cool of the day. Eden was a place whose name meant delight. The air there held 1,000 small mercies, the faint sweetness of ripened figs, the damp perfume of tilled earth, the low, unhurried murmur of waters running to a hidden stream. Trees stood in a pointed rows by God's design, each bearing its kind. Birds nested without fear, and beasts moved at ease beneath the shade. In that ordered beauty, Adam and Eve learned the work of tending, the art of naming, and the simpler joys of companionship. They lacked for nothing that was good. If you would stay with this telling until the end, and if your heart seeks understanding of how the promise first dawned in the midst of ruin, I invite you to remain. And for those who wish to hear words like these again, consider subscribing and enabling the bell so that you may be reminded when such truth is brought before you. Stay and listen to the blessing that follows. Eve knew the garden as one learns a homeland, by touch and by memory. Her hands learned the differing textures of leaf and bark, the sweet sap of figs that stained the fingers, the cool give of loamy soil that yielded to a careful palm. She rose with the sun and walked with Adam, and her voice wove itself into the fabric of that beginning. She wondered often at the great tree at the garden's heart, its trunk wide and dignified, leaves whispering like a congregation. The Lord had set there 2 trees of weight, one bearing life, the other bearing a knowledge he had kept. To it he had spoken a boundary, from that one, do not eat. A command, simple, a boundary set in love, not caprice. Among the creatures there was one who watched with a different craft. The serpent moved with a guile that betrayed neither fear nor submission. Its eyes were keen. Its manner was what is softest in the animal, yet sharpened by a cunning that made the hair rise upon the neck of the one who observed. It spoke not as beasts speak in their lowing or their bleat, but with a subtle question that the woman could not mistake for the mere noise of the field. "Did God say you must not eat of every tree?" the serpent asked, its voice a smooth thing that slipped between leaves. Eve answered as one instructed, "We may eat of the fruit of the garden's trees, but of the tree that stands in the middle, the Lord said, 'You shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die.'" The serpent's reply was a threading of doubt into certainty. It drew near, and where its tongue touched the air, it seemed to make the fruit more vivid, the skin more luminous, the taste more conceivable. "You shall not surely die," it said. "Your eyes will be opened. You will be like the Most High, knowing good and evil." The temptation was not a sudden thunder. It was a patient unveiling. The serpent put before Eve a scene of what might be. Knowledge that would make her wise, an elevation that would lift her from dependence. It did not shout, but suggested. And in the suggestion, the seed of discontent found soil. Eve looked upon the fruit, and her mind made small bargains. She saw that the tree was good for food. She saw that it was pleasant to the eyes. It was a desirable thing for gaining wisdom. The slow arithmetic of desire and promise did its work. She took and ate. Then she gave to her husband with her, and he ate. The world changed in a breath that was longer than a moment. Where before there had been innocence, there arose a sudden knowledge of nakedness. The skin of both was perceived as something to be hidden. Leaves were plucked and woven into coverings, and the sound that had been laughter and labor was cut by the sound of people who had discovered shame. In that instant, the earth itself seemed to bear witness to the fracture. The harmony of creature and creator was altered. When the Lord walked in the garden at the cool of the day, they hid themselves among the trees. He called, as he had called before in gentleness, but now his voice carried the weight of sorrow and upright truth. "Where are you?" he asked. Adam answered, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." God's question drew forth what had passed. He asked, and Adam told of the woman he had given, and the food that she had given him to eat. Then the Lord turned to the woman, and the woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." Thus the ancient ordering of things came to judgment. God spoke to the serpent with words that unspooled both condemnation and a slender thread of hope. He would set enmity between the serpent and the woman, between its seed and her seed, a hostility that would run through ages. "One day," said the Lord, "the offspring of the woman would strike at the head of the tempter, while the tempter would bruise his heel." There was wrath in that sentence, for it pronounced the chasm sin had made. And yet within it there was a promise, an assurance that the serpent's triumph would be neither total nor final. The Lord then addressed the woman and the man. To the woman he spoke of intensified travail in childbearing, and the complicated sway of desire and rule within relationships changed by sin. To the man he spoke of the cursed ground. Toil would become harder, sweat would be their bread, and returning to dust would be the end. Still, even as consequence flowed, God did not let their fate be the last word. He clothed them with garments made from skins, an act that both covered their shame and pointed to cost, for such coverings came by the shedding of life. These scenes move with a providence that never loses sight of the promise. The seed spoken of in Eden was no idle image. In the line of Abraham, in the sheltering of the patriarchs, in the kingship of David, the whisper of that early pronouncement traveled like a thread through the tapestry. David's line, set apart, became the house through which a greater seed would come. Prophets arose who saw beyond their present, who declared of a child to be born. Peace and justice would be his rule. He would be called Mighty God and Prince of Peace. They spoke as those who had read the Lord's handwriting upon the ages, for they too discerned that Eden's promise pointed to a final overturning of the serpent's sway. When the fullness of time came, the narrative reached toward Bethlehem. A virgin named Mary accepted a staggering annunciation. She would bear a son, and his name would be holy, his nature divine. He was wrapped in swaddling cloth and laid in a manger, humble as the beginnings of the world, yet luminous with significance. The one who would at last bruise the head of the tempter walked among men as a man, teaching, healing, calling the lost to repentance, and collecting around himself a remnant of faithful ones. He came into conflict with the powers that kept men bound, religious authorities, fearful hearts, systems that loved order more than righteousness. In the end, he was betrayed, delivered to judgment, scourged, and nailed upon a tree outside Jerusalem. The earth shuddered, the veil rent, death seemed for a moment to have the last word. And yet, on the third day, the tomb was found empty. He rose, and by that rising, he displayed the meaning of the first promise with a clarity that the garden's language had only hinted. The bruising of head and heel, a word spoken in Eden's sorrow, unfolded into a victory whose measure the prophets had longed to know. It is a long road from a stolen bite in a garden to the empty linen in a tomb, yet every step is threaded by the same purpose. The first promise is not a vague consolation. It is the hinge upon which the whole story turns. Where sin brought fracture, God's word brought a direction toward healing. Where shame clothed the first pair, God would clothe sinners with the righteousness offered by the seed. Hear this, then, as both narrative and summons. The history that begins with Eve and the serpent does not end in exile. In the pronouncement given to the woman, there is both condemnation of evil and the earliest announcement of mercy. The Lord who judges sin also plants hope at the very moment of his judgment, as if to say that even when humanity turns away, he will not leave us without a way back. Yet do not reduce the promise to mere optimism. It cost God something.
The covering of skins that sheltered Adam and Eve testified to that cost. The cross itself would declare it plainly.
The seed would come by way of suffering, and deliverance would be accomplished not by the avoidance of pain, but by its bearing. The bruising that was spoken of implied conflict and price, and God chose that path willingly. As the generations pressed on, men of faith arise who point toward this seed. Abraham's faith was counted to him as righteousness, and his hope reached beyond his own life. David's throne leaned forward toward one who would rule an eternal kingdom, and the prophet's songs lit the way like beacons in a dark night. In the fullness of time, the seed appeared in human form, and what began as a whisper in Eden became a proclamation in the streets of Jerusalem: death has been swallowed by life. This is the skeleton of the tale. Its flesh is the small human moments where choices are made. Think of Eve's hand reaching. Think of her face when she understood. Think of God's voice calling, and of the promise placed like a lamp in the doorway of their exile. These are not mere scenes. They are windows through which we see the character of God, just and merciful, wroth and merciful still, and the persistent plan that moves from garden to cross to empty tomb. Now the story turns its gaze forward, for the seed's work was not accomplished in private but in history. Israel would be called to carry the memory of Eden's breach and the hope of Eden's mending. The law would mark a people, prophets would warn and console, kings would rise and fall. God's hand would move in ways both visible and hidden, preparing a people through whom the seed would come and be manifested. Yet before those preparations could be fully told, there were days of wandering and failing, of judges who rose and fell, of hearts that turned from the voice of God. Still, the promise persisted. It followed the line of Seth, passed through flood and scattering, threaded through Abraham's faith and Jacob's struggles, through Isaac's birth and Joseph's suffering. Each generation carried both the wound and the promise, living with the knowledge that the world was not as it should be, and that God had given a word that would not be nullified by human sin. In the hush that follows the pronouncement to the woman, one may hear two sounds, the sob of judgment and the whisper of hope. One sound acknowledges the ruin, the other points to repair. The Lord's word to Eve, a sentence in an early world, reaches forward with a clarity that will, in time, be seen in the cross and the empty tomb. The seed striking in a manner that confounds the serpent's victory, and in the end, bringing life where once there was death. So the reader is left to consider the weight and the tenderness of that first promise. It is a declaration that even at the moment of the fall, when humanity's voice was used to rebellion, God was already speaking redemption. The promise is not ambiguous. It is the first note of a song that will be sung in fuller tones through the ages.
It is the Lord's commitment that the breach will not stand, that the serpent's power has a time-limited dominion, and that the seed will come. From here, the narrative will unfold the line of promise, the call of Abraham, the testing of faith, the rise of a nation through suffering and deliverance, and finally, the coming of the seed in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Each step will show how the original word given to the woman is neither idle nor accidental, but the master key by which the whole story unlocks. Hold this thread now. The promise placed at Eden's gate will be traced through covenant and exile, through kingship and prophecy, until it arrives visibly in Bethlehem and on Golgotha, where the seed's conflict with the serpent will be waged to its decisive end. The tale moves on, and the next appointed scenes will show how God prepared a lineage, a law, a people, how he would not abandon the plan begun in that first sorrowful pronouncement. So the thread runs on, and the voice of promise finds a man named Abram in the tents of Ur and in the grazing fields beside the oaks of Mamre. The Lord called him forth from his kindred and his father's house, and Abram went, not knowing the road's end, but holding fast to a word, a land for his seed, a blessing for the nations. In the hush of that pledge, there was both demand and mercy. Leave, walk, believe. And the promise set itself like a lamp upon his path. And Abram believed, and it was recounted to him as righteousness. Years braided doubt with hope, a wife who laughed at the prospect of a son, a child born in the season of impossibility. Isaac came, and with him the tighter knot of testing. The command to offer the son placed Abraham at the edge of obedience, and there his faith was measured and proved. The hand that would have felled Isaac was stayed, and the ram in the thicket became both provision and symbol. God provides. In that trial, the promise did not fail. Rather, it was affirmed that the offspring would be counted not by human sight, but by divine reckoning. From Isaac, the line continued in ways both simple and troubled. Jacob wrestled through the night until his hip was put out of joint and his name changed. He left with a limp and a blessing, carrying in his bones the uneasy future of the people yet to be formed. Joseph, son of Jacob, was sold into Egypt, and the pit that would have been his grave became the gate of preservation. In the granaries of Pharaoh, his patient wisdom kept many alive during famine. Through the exile in a foreign court, the family was gathered and multiplied. The promise endured, even in the stores and corridors of a foreign land, bending suffering to the work of God's saving purpose. So it came to pass that the children of Israel multiplied exceedingly in Egypt until a king arose who knew not Joseph. Their numbers became a burden to the rulers, and bondage followed.
The cry of their affliction rose up as incense to the Lord, and in the burning bush a new voice called Moses, the deliverer shaped in the waters and trained in the courts. He who had fled to Midian returned by command and by miracle, confronting plagues and hardening hearts, until the sea was made a way, and the people walked dry-shod through waters that were walls on either side. Thus Israel was borne out of captivity into a wilderness where the Lord would speak at Sinai and give the law. At Sinai, the covenant took form, commandments, statutes, a pattern for holy living. The people heard thunder and trumpet, they trembled at the mountain, and the law descended like a boundary that would mark them apart. The tabernacle's design was given, that God might dwell among his people, mercy seat and veil, incense and sacrifice, signs that holiness both draws near and demands respect. In the wilderness, the people learned reliance, tasted both bread from heaven and bitterness of complaint. In their wandering, the promise wove itself through numbers, ordinances, and the repeated mercy of the Lord who fed and led. When the land was at last entered, it was not simply a piece of earth delivered by conquest. It was the place in which the seed would be nurtured, a theater for kingship and temple, for covenant fidelity and for failure. Judges arose in seasons of need, warriors, deliverers, flawed men raised by the Spirit to rescue and then to fade. The cycle of turning and returning showed the fragile commitment of a people and the patient chastening of a God who would not forsake his own purpose. In time, the cry for a king grew loud. Samuel, the last of the judges and a prophet, anointed Saul at the people's desire. Saul's reign, like his heart, wavered between might and insecurity. The Lord sought another and chose David, a shepherd boy whose song and sword would alter the shape of the nation. David's hearth after God, though marred by failure, bore a promise of an enduring throne. It was declared that from David's house would arise an everlasting rule. In his Psalms we hear the foreshadowing of one who would be both king and sufferer, the true Son whose throne would be established forever. Solomon, his son, built the temple, stone and cedar, vessels of gold, altars of smoke. And for a season the Lord's name was rooted among his people, in a dwelling place that expressed both splendor and worship. Wisdom's proverbs and the temple's rites made a city of meaning. Yet even in that height, splintering followed. The kingdom divided after Solomon's fall into north and south, and the land was pricked by idolatry and injustice. Prophets arose like lamp-bearers in a dark night, voices that would not be silenced. Isaiah spoke of a suffering servant and of a shoot from Jesse's stump. His prophecies mixed woe and hope, warning and the promise of a restored righteousness. Jeremiah wept for a people who would be carried away, his laments like the sound of a bereaved father watching the city broken. Ezekiel, by the river Chebar, saw visions of dry bones made to live, and of God's glory departing and later returning. Images that kept alive the belief that death would not have the final word. Daniel, in foreign courts, held fast to the sovereignty of God amid the fury of empires. His visions reached into the times to come, sketching the outlines of God's ultimate triumph over the beasts of power. Thus the prophets kept the promise articulate across generations. Exile would come as chastening, but exile would not be the end. In captivity, the heart of the people was stripped and refined, the temple lay desolate, and yet even among ruins a new faith was being forged. Songs spoke of the return. The servant who would take up sorrow and carry the infirmities of men was teased out of the prophetic word. The Messiah's suffering was spoken of as though it were a servant's song, pierced, exalted, a ransom for many. These words threaded grief with destiny, and Israel's passions and returns became stages where the promise's light flickered and then burned brighter. The centuries moved with the measured steps of history. Empires rose, overlords came and went, yet the promise did not stray. Priests kept the rites, scribes kept the law, and the people kept memory. In the marketplace and by the wells, the stories of Abraham and of the Exodus were told to children. The Psalms gave voice to lament and confidence alike. Synagogue and scholar preserved expectation. A king from David's line, a prophet like Moses, a new covenant written upon the heart. At last, in the fullness of time, a young woman in Nazareth received the astonishing annunciation. A child would be born who would be both seed and savior. The lineage of promise, traced through desert and palace, through pit and palace again, now met in the quiet of a manger. Bethlehem, the little town tied to David's name, became the stage of humility where the royal promise took on flesh. The road from Eden had curved through sorrow and law, through exile and song, only to arrive in a stable where the hope of many was born in weakness rather than splendor. So the narrative that began with a bruise and a pledge touched the lowly cradle. The seed appeared as a child who would grow in wisdom and grace, who would teach as one with authority, who would be hailed by some and opposed by others. His life gathered the threads already laid: covenant promise, sacrificial imagery, prophetic fulfillment. He walked the lanes of Galilee and Jerusalem with the purpose of the ages in his words and works, and every act, feeding, healing, forgiving, echoed the ancient lamp at Eden's gate. Yet the way of the seed remained the way of cost. Opposition hardened into plots, and the path bent towards Golgotha, where the serpent's head would be bruised by means that the world could not at first understand. From garden to cross, the story kept its fidelity. A promise given when the first pair stood in shame. A promise fulfilled in one who bore the wounds that would undo the serpent's claim. In that bearing, the full nature of God's justice and mercy met, and the narrative that had threaded through patriarchs, judges, kings, and prophets reached its decisive, costly turning. It is here, at the foot of the cross and before the empty tomb, that the ancient word finally shows its face in human history. Fragile, scandalous, and utterly potent. The seed's work is the hinge on which all preceding scenes turn. It is the fulfillment that vindicates the lamp at Eden and the laments of exile alike. From this vantage, the reader may look back and see how every trial, every promise, every sacrifice was a preparatory note, a movement leading to the resolution where death would meet life and the serpent's deceit be undone by a suffering that becomes triumph. And yet the tale does not end with the empty tomb alone, it extends forward. The resurrection sends forth an imperative, to live as a people shaped by this deliverance, to bear the sign of the repaired relationship in conduct, worship, and mission. The covenantal thread, begun when dust was shaped into a man and reinforced at Sinai, finds its new form in a people reconciled and sent.
The promise that once lay like a lamp at Eden's door now becomes a lamp carried into the world. The seed's life and resurrection call for a response, for a people to receive and to reflect the reality of mended creation. There remain scenes to tell, how the apostles take up the witness, how the church is born amid persecution and proclamation, how the message moves from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. But the central hinge is set. The echo of Eden's first word is audible now in the proclamation of life where death once reigned. The promise has threaded history, and having met its climax, bids the generations that follow to live in the light it has cast, stewarding a hope that will not be extinguished by time nor trial. The first witnesses did not wait. In the wake of the empty tomb, an urgent fidelity took hold of those who had touched the hands and heard the voice of the risen one. The same people who had fled at night, who had doubted and slept, now found speech and courage as if a new breath had been breathed into them. In an upper room, behind shuttered doors, they gathered with the memory of his sayings and the weight of his commands. They returned to the pattern of synagogue and prayer, but with a new center, the conviction that death had been conquered and that the promise of mending had been enacted in a single, scandalous life. When the promise was poured out as Spirit in Jerusalem, the city itself became the scene of a fresh beginning. A sound as of a mighty wind, tongues of fire resting on heads, speech unloosed that crossed barriers and startled the crowds at the festival.
Peter stood, no longer the man who thrice denied, but a witness who named the suffering, the vindication, and the gift promised from the Father. He spoke of the psalm that the psalmist had cried, and of the prophet who had foretold a pouring out of God's life upon flesh. The people who heard were pierced. 3,000 were added that day, a community born in the language of repentance and baptism. Thus the seed of promise grew into a people. They gathered at the temple and in houses, shared what they had, tended the poor, and broke bread, remembering the night in which betrayal and love had been knit. Wonders and signs accompanied their proclamation. The lame walked where they had been carried. The sick were made whole. Suffering was borne with a dignity not their own. But to the very attestation of power there came opposition. The rulers and the learned strove to extinguish that which they did not understand or could not control. Arrests followed preaching. Threats came where there had been joy. Yet persecution had, beneath its cruelty, a paradoxical effect. It scattered the faithful outward. Scattering was not mere defeat. It was the movement of seed upon the wind. From Jerusalem, the message went north and west and east, into Judea, Samaria, Antioch, and beyond the bound of the Old Covenant's heartland. Philip carried the word into Samaritan towns and met God moving among those whom older enmities had kept aside. The story of Cornelius, a man outside the house of Israel, showed that the covenant circle could widen. God's compass of mercy did not end at ancestral lines. Peter, wrestling with vision and hospitality, found that the Spirit fell upon Gentiles as naturally as upon those born under the law. And the church learned by experience what the promise had always implied. The lamp at Eden was meant to illuminate all corners of the earth. Among those who took this news was Saul of Tarsus, a man formed in zeal for the traditions, who had moved to silence the new movement with violence. On a road to Damascus, he met a light that unmade his certainties and remade his vocation. From persecutor, he became apostle. From hunter, a sower. Paul carried the gospel through cities of Hellenic speech and Roman rule, arguing with philosophers in the marketplaces, writing letters that would stand as instruction and encouragement, binding communities together across distance. His journeys traced a map of the ancient world, ports and plazas, synagogues and agorae, inns and hearths where the faithful met. Where he could not be present, his epistles became a presence, teaching, correcting, consoling, shaping how these scattered churches would think about life in the light of the risen seed. The early decades were a mix of proclamation and formation. In councils of elders and in the house of the apostles, questions were brought and answers sought. How does the old law remain with those who embrace the new life?
What practices mark the people of the covenant under the new order? At Jerusalem, leaders argued and prayed and, with courage, declared that Gentiles could be included without first becoming Jews in every ceremonial way. This decision carried the gospel beyond the narrow gate of ethnic belonging and set the church on a path less of ethnic continuity than of spiritual communion. Yet belonging required forms. Baptism became the entry into the new creation, a washing that signaled death to the old and rising to life. The breaking of bread became a remembrance and a participation in the broken and risen one. Elders and deacons were chosen, letters traveled and were read aloud, psalms and teachings circled the tables. The faith shaped patterns: how to gather, how to care, how to instruct the young, how to remember the martyrs who sealed the testimony with their blood. Martyrdom came quickly. Stephen stood before the council and offered a recitation of the history of the covenant, patriarchs, deliverance, prophetic chastening, and then, accused and stoned, he looked like his Lord, praying, commending his spirit. The blood of martyrs scattered the seed further. Families that fled persecution took with them the story and the sign. Where force meant to bury the truth, it instead spread it. Across the Mediterranean world, the faith entered forms and fought. Greek language provided a vehicle for the proclamation. Stoic and Platonic categories met the biblical witness and both challenged and aided its expression. The church wrestled with the shape of God and the mystery of the seed's twofold nature, fully bound to humanity and yet truly divine. Out of those debates came creeds, concise affirmations that said in measured words what must not be lost in the swirl of controversy. The creeds became cords that bound disparate communities to a common confession, even when bishops and teachers stood in distant cities and the means of travel were slow. Authority took shape around bishops who shepherded communities, and the exchange between local gatherings and the wider communion produced practices that endured. The reading of Scripture, catechesis for new believers, the care of widows and orphans, offerings for the poor. With growth came complexity. The Roman world provided both highway and hurdle. The pax that ensured travel also meant imperial eyes that, at times, mistrusted an allegiance that acknowledged another king. Persecutions waxed and waned, local disturbances at first, later periodic waves emanating from governors and emperors who saw this new sect as a threat to unity. Then a larger turn occurred. An emperor who had once sought dominion over all things, who had seen the city's worship pressed into the service of the state, perceived, slowly and unevenly, that the faith would not be quenched. The modern horizon arrived with new instruments of movement and new perplexities of thought. The lamp, carried by missionaries and merchants, by migrants and magistrates, entered continents that had not known the rhythm of temple or synagogue. The gospel met cultures formed by other worships and asked how the light could be translated without losing its core. Some translations were faithful, others bore the marks of cultural imposition. The church's mission pressed forward, sometimes bearing generous service, schools, hospitals, and care for the least, and sometimes entangled with the ambitions of states. This duality required discernment. To be a bearer of the lamp was to remember that the lamp's purpose was not empire, but repair. Intellectually, the church engaged the new sciences and philosophies with curiosity and criticism. Theology and philosophy conversed and sometimes clashed. New understandings of human nature and cosmos invited the faithful to refine confession and to re-articulate what the seed's victory meant in an expanding knowledge of God's good creation. Theologies of creation, of sin, of grace, and of hope were retold, clarified, and contested in sermons, treatises, and debates across university halls and in parish pulpits. Through wars, famines, and philosophical revolutions, the lamp's caretakers kept asking the same question, first posed at Eden. How shall humanity live rightly in a world that bears both beauty and fracture? The answer never via institution alone, but by the faithful life lived in covenantal shapes, Prayer, mercy, justice, and worship remained the pattern. Movements of renewal rose within the church anew and again, drawing people back to prayer and sacrificial love, and the song of the Psalms was taught to infants even as elders conversed about doctrine. Toward the present age, the narrative gathers both hope and urgency. The seed's people now find themselves strewn in every nation, tongues, and culture. The lamp's light is seen in villages and megacities alike, in remote hamlets and in capitals. Yet the world that receives the lamp is changed. Lines of communication have tightened, the scale of human knowledge has broadened, and with such increase comes new temptation and new responsibility. The old questions reappear in new clothes: power and humility, wealth and witness, truth and charity. The covenant's call persists, to be a people who embody the repair of creation, who carry the lamp not as an ornament but as a task, to heal, to reconcile, to live under the authority of the one who bore wounds to undo the serpent's claim. So the story presses on, not toward a neat conclusion, but into ongoing fidelity. The apostles' witness sparked a movement that learned to confess, to suffer, to govern, to pray, and to give. Each generation took up the lamp, sometimes polishing it with care, sometimes letting it dim, and yet the flame endured. The march from Eden to the empty tomb and beyond finds in every age new actors and new scenes. The covenantal thread remains taut, calling, convicting, promising. The lamp that began at a garden gate still waits to be placed in every human heart that will admit its need for light. The seed's victory still demands of those who bear it a life of repair. There are, however, stories yet to be told in full: the particular struggles of communities in later centuries, the reforms that sought renewal, the ways the gospel met the complexities of empire and nationhood, and the faces of common folk who, in ordinary days, embodied extraordinary faith. There are also the ordinary reckonings, the conversions not marked by spectacle but by morning prayers, the small acts of mercy that passed unnoticed yet mended a life, the confessions murmured in quiet rooms, the reconciliations that smoothed family rifts. These too are part of how the lamp is kept. For now, the narrative moves forward in time and in hearts. The people who carry the lamp must learn the old arts anew, to listen to the scriptures with humility, to pray with endurance, to love enemies as well as friends, to bear one another's burdens, and to pursue justice as an outworking of mercy. The covenant invites each generation to a fidelity that must be lived in concrete ways, through speech and deed, through governance and service, through sorrow and joy. The lamp will be passed again and again, and the torchbearers of each era will be judged by whether they tended the flame or let it flicker. The road continues, and along it are hospitality houses and battlefields, monasteries and marketplaces, councils and lonely rooms where repentance begins. The pages ahead will speak of particular struggles: how doctrine was clarified amid heresy, how worship assumed forms that shaped hearts, how the poor were tended by hands that had been taught to regard them as neighbors and brothers. They will tell of failures that required penance and of reforms that sought to return the church to its first love. They will tell as well of the quiet faithfulness of unnamed men and women whose lives kept the lamp alight. But before those detailed scenes unfold, the narrative must pause to acknowledge the abiding demand. To be a people of the promise is not merely to inherit a story, but to inhabit a vocation. The lamp is not merely an heirloom to be admired. It is a fire to be carried into nights yet unlit, into places where the serpent still exerts mischief. The covenant that began in a garden and was sealed at a manger and solidified at an empty tomb presses forward into history with urgency and tenderness. Those called to bear it are summoned to live as a reconciled community, to enact in daily ways the healing for which the world still aches. So the chronicle continues, moving from councils and creeds down into the small alleys of human life, there to show how the grand promises are worked out in humble fidelity. But before those detailed scenes unfold, the narrative must pause to acknowledge the abiding demand. To be a people of the promise is not merely to inherit a story, but to inhabit a vocation. The lamp is not merely an heirloom to be admired. It is a fire to be carried into nights yet unlit, into places where the serpent still exerts mischief. The covenant that began in a garden and was sealed at a manger and solidified at an empty tomb presses forward into history with urgency and tenderness. Those called to bear it are summoned to live as a reconciled community, to enact in daily ways the healing for which the world still aches. So the chronicle continues, moving from councils and creeds down into the small alleys of human life, there to show how the grand promises are worked out in humble fidelity.
From Jerusalem to Rome, from cloister to frontier, from catechesis to martyrdom, the lamp keeps its way. The next scenes will draw closer to particular crises and particular graces, to the ways the Church sought reform and how ordinary believers answered the call in times of trial. They will bring forward characters both famed and obscure, and through their stories, the covenant's long thread will be seen yet again as a single, unbroken strand guiding human hearts toward repair. So the chronicle narrows its gaze. It turns toward the 4th century, where emperors and bishops would wrestle with the shape of the faith, councils convened to name the word, confessors who stood against error, and monks who retreated to deserts and cells to rehearse a life of repair. There would be creeds forged in the furnace of debate, lives broken and mended, and a church learning by trial what fidelity costs and what it restores.